Somewhere in an evidence room in Snohomish County sits a boot. It belonged to a 20-year-old woman who rode her bike out one August afternoon in 1972 and never made it home. For 36 years, that boot just sat there, tested and retested by people who never found what they were looking for. Passed between investigators who came and went over the decades, each one hoping to be the one who finally cracked it. Cold cases move in cycles. A new detective picks up the file, brings fresh energy to it, exhausts the same leads, and eventually sets it down again. This case went through that cycle more than once before the right tool finally existed to break it open. Then in 2008, someone finally did. A lab technician picked up the same boot that had already failed 2 earlier rounds of testing and found a trace of DNA so small it had gone unnoticed every time before. It still wasn't enough to name a suspect. The technology to match that trace to a real person hadn't been invented yet. The man who left it behind had another 10 years left to live an ordinary life before anyone caught up to him. Married, working, going about his routine just a few miles from where it happened, with absolutely no idea that a single discarded coffee cup would eventually undo all of it. Jody Loomis was 20, living at home in Bothell, Washington with her parents, John and Rosemary, her fiancé, Jim Roberts, and her younger sister, Jana, who was 12 at the time. On the afternoon of August 23, 1972, Jody asked to borrow Jana's new boots, the ones bought for the coming school year, so she could ride her bike out to a stable a few miles off and check on her horse, Saudi. Most reports put her age at 20, though a few list her as 19. We're going with 20 here, since that matches the coverage closest to the time. She got about 3.5 miles into the ride before anyone saw her again, pedaling up a hill on what's now called Mill Creek Road, in an area that was still mostly farmland and forest back then. The city of Mill Creek itself wouldn't even be incorporated for another 11 years. A 14-year-old girl working a roadside fruit stand saw her pass and pause briefly at an intersection around 5 p.m. That girl was the last person known to have seen Jody alive. Somewhere past that intersection, someone pulled her off the road and into the woods east of the Bothell-Everett Highway. She was attacked and fatally shot with a .22 caliber weapon. There's no evidence she knew whoever did it, and nothing to suggest she would have walked into those woods with a stranger by choice. Prosecutors would later argue she had to have been forced or lured somehow off a road she'd ridden dozens of times before without incident. 2 people driving by spotted her in the brush around 5:30 that evening. Kathy Lennox, 18, going by her maiden name Gogol at the time, and Walter Morris, 33, got her into their car right away and drove for Stevens Memorial Hospital in Edmonds. She didn't survive the trip. For the next 47 years, hers would be the oldest open homicide case on the books in Snohomish County. That evening, a detective drove out to the Loomis house to deliver the news. The family was devastated. The Loomis home, which hours earlier had been an ordinary household with an ordinary evening ahead of it, became the center of something that would take 48 years to resolve. Investigators processed the scene in the woods, collecting what little physical evidence they could find. The boots were taken into evidence along with other items recovered near where Jody was found. At the time, nobody knew those boots would be the most important item in the entire case file. They were just evidence, logged and stored, one more object in a box that was about to sit in a room for a very long time. It's easy to lose the person inside a case file like this one. Jody painted a mural of horses running across her bedroom wall. She picked up injured animals off the side of the road and nursed them back to health. People who knew her say she didn't hold back an opinion, ever, regardless of who was in the room. She was engaged to be married, with a wedding somewhere ahead of her, and horses had been part of her life for years, not some new interest. That ride out to see Saudi was one she'd made more times than anyone could count. Her mother had reminded her before she left to bring a dime in case she needed to call home if she ran late. Investigators later found a dime near where she was discovered, a small detail that ended up sitting in the case file for the next 48 years.
Back in 1972, investigators had witness statements and not much else. The fruit stand witness, just 14 years old, gave police what she could: the time, the direction, the brief pause at the intersection. Detectives interviewed her more than once over the coming weeks, hoping a small detail might surface that hadn't before. But her account stayed the same every time. A local ranch owner who'd made Jody uncomfortable in the past became an early focus. His name came up quickly once investigators started asking around, and detectives sat down with him multiple times in the days and weeks after the murder. He had no alibi that fully held up, but he also had nothing physically tying him to the scene. A second person of interest, a man who'd reportedly been cutting wood in the area that day, went through a similar process: interviews, follow-up interviews, and ultimately no physical evidence that went anywhere. Without forensic tools that could place either man at the scene, investigators had nowhere left to take it. Jody's bridle, missing from the scene since the day it happened, was never recovered. Within a few years, with no new leads coming in and no forensic path left to follow, the case had effectively gone cold. The kind of stall that, in an era before DNA, often meant a case simply stayed open forever, without ever moving again. For the Loomis family, those decades without answers meant living alongside an open question that never went away. John and Rosemary Loomis grew older without ever seeing the case resolved. For Jana, growing up meant growing up as the sister whose borrowed boots had become part of a murder investigation. Cases like this one don't just sit still in a file room. They sit with the families too, surfacing every time a detective calls with nothing new to report, every time a local paper runs an anniversary piece, every time the calendar turns to August. It's worth remembering what police in 1972 simply didn't have. DNA testing as a forensic tool wouldn't exist for another decade or so, and it would be even longer before it became a routine part of police work. Nobody thought to test a pair of boots for biological evidence the way a department would today, mostly because the science to do anything useful with that evidence hadn't been invented yet. A case like this one, with no confession, no surviving physical evidence anyone knew to test, and a short list of suspects who all came up clean, simply had nowhere left to go. That stayed true for over 30 years. Then, in 2005, cold case detective Jim Scharf reopened the file, one of dozens he was working through as part of a county-wide push to revisit unsolved homicides with whatever new tools had become available since the original investigations closed. Scharf went back through every original report, every interview transcript, every piece of physical evidence that had survived in storage. He recontacted surviving witnesses, tracked down family members who'd moved away, and looked specifically for anything that might be worth running through modern forensic testing. Cold case work is mostly methodical elimination, ruling out what can't help until you find the one thing that might. In this case, that one thing turned out to have been sitting in storage the whole time, waiting for 2008 to arrive. Around the same time, the case found a second life in public. The sheriff's office printed playing cards featuring unsolved cases, distributed in jails on the chance someone behind bars might know something they'd never had a reason to share. A volunteer named Chuck Wright carried Jody's card for the next 10 years and kept writing about her case in a local paper, the Mill Creek Beacon, just to keep her name circulating. In 2010, a journalist named Casey McNerthney published a story asking readers directly whether anyone out there could help crack the case, with no idea that the answer was already sitting, untested, in a state crime lab. Because in 2008, a technician retesting evidence from Jody's boots had found something nobody caught before: a usable trace of DNA.
It took 3 separate passes over the same physical evidence, spanning more than 3 decades before anyone found it at all. Run through CODIS, the National Criminal Database, it came back with nothing. CODIS only contains DNA profiles from people who've been arrested for qualifying offenses, which means it works well when the person you're looking for has a criminal record. When they don't, it's a dead end. Whoever left that trace on Jody's boot had managed to avoid the kind of arrest that would have put his DNA in the system, despite a history that, as investigators would later discover, went back decades. The case stalled out one more time. There was finally evidence. There still wasn't a name. The method that eventually cracked this case barely existed in 2008. It made headlines a few years later when it was used to catch the Golden State Killer in California, the case that showed law enforcement nationwide what was suddenly possible with public DNA databases. By 2018, Snohomish County detectives decided to try the same approach on their own oldest unsolved case. Genealogist Deb Stone took the DNA profile from Jody's boot and traced it back to a couple in Edmonds, Jaquette and Albert Miller, who'd had 6 sons. 2 had already died by the time investigators started looking at the family. Of the remaining 4, 1 had a background that made detectives sit up. Terrence Miller, a man with a long history of alleged offenses that had never resulted in serious charges. A family tree only gets you so far, though. It's a list of possibilities, not proof of anything. Confirming Miller specifically meant getting his actual DNA without him knowing he was a suspect, since a suspect who feels watched can destroy evidence or simply disappear before anyone can act. For weeks, detectives just watched him live his life, running his small pottery business, going about an entirely normal routine with no idea anyone was paying attention. On August 29, 2018, they got their opening. Miller finished a cup of coffee at the Tulalip Resort Casino and threw the cup away. Investigators collected it from the trash. A week or so later, the results came back. It was him. The DNA on that cup matched the profile that had been sitting on Jody's boot since 1972, closing a 46-year gap in a single lab report. For Snohomish County, it was also the first arrest this exact technique had ever produced. Within days of the match being confirmed, detectives began building the arrest package. By 2018, Terrence Miller was 77, retired from a career running heavy equipment, spending his days making pottery with his wife Linda out of a home business called Miller's Cove. He'd been married to her for around 43 years, his 4th marriage. He lived about 5 miles from where Jody had been found, in a quiet neighborhood near 164th Avenue Southwest, with an Edmonds mailing address that technically sat inside unincorporated Snohomish County. He had lived in the greater Snohomish and King County area essentially his entire adult life, moving through different addresses over the decades, but never leaving the region where Jody was killed. In 1972, when she died, he was 26 years old. Across his marriages, he'd had 5 daughters, 2 of them with his 3rd wife before that marriage ended in 1974. Police had crossed paths with him before, just never on this case. In 1968, he was cited for lewd conduct involving a teenage girl in Mount Lake Terrace, an incident he later admitted to in a police interview. He was 30 at the time, 2 years before Jody died. A 1978 case involving a serious allegation against a child was deferred after he made admissions to police. 2 more allegations surfaced in 1990 and 1 in 1999, none of which led to charges for reasons ranging from thin evidence to statutes of limitations that had already run out by the time anyone looked into them seriously. None of it connected back to Jody specifically. As far as investigators could tell, the 2 had never crossed paths before that afternoon. This was, by every account, a stranger encountering a stranger. Even some of Miller's longtime friends struggled with that idea afterward. One reportedly asked him outright after the arrest whether he'd really done it. Miller was arrested at home in April 2019 and charged with first-degree premeditated murder. Sheriff's Captain Rob Palmer told reporters at the press conference that the department was one step closer to justice for Jody and her family. 47 years after it opened, the case finally had a name attached to it. Miller was held on $1 million bail and, according to investigators, wasn't especially cooperative during questioning. For the community that had carried this story for decades, the arrest landed as both relief and a strange kind of unease. The man accused wasn't a drifter who'd passed through once and vanished. He'd been living a few miles away the entire time, running a small business, going about an unremarkable life, never once suspected by anyone who knew him. Investigators were still asking the public for help even after the arrest, looking for old details like what kind of car Miller drove back in the early 70s and where exactly he'd been working at the time. Jody's bridle was never found, and at this point, probably never will be. At his arraignment, Miller pleaded not guilty, appearing by video with public defender Laura Martin representing him. 2 months in, the defense pushed to lower his $1 million bail, citing his wife Linda's recent stroke and her dependence on him as a caretaker. Prosecutors objected, pointing back to his history of prior allegations as reason enough to keep bail high. Judge David Kurtz split the difference. Bail dropped to $750,000, with conditions attached, including surrendering his passport and wearing a GPS monitor. Linda addressed the court herself briefly about what it would mean to lose him for good. The trial started in October 2020 in Snohomish County Superior Court in front of Judge Kurtz. Over 2 weeks, prosecutors Craig Matheson and Bob Langbin built their case almost entirely around the DNA, walking the 12-person jury from the original crime scene through the 2008 retest to the 2018 genealogy work that finally produced a name. They called multiple forensic experts to explain each stage of the process in plain terms, understanding that a jury in 2020 would need to follow a chain of science that spanned 3 different eras of forensic technology, from 1972 evidence collection methods through modern genealogy software, with a CODIS database search in between. The genealogist herself testified, explaining how a hobbyist ancestry website built years earlier for people tracing their own family history ended up pointing back at a man none of its users had any idea was connected to a murder case. Detective Kendra Conley walked the jury through how the physical evidence had been tracked and preserved across nearly 5 decades of storage and transfers, a chain of custody question that mattered just as much as the science itself. Jana Loomis Smith, Jody's sister, took the stand too. She was 12 when Jody borrowed those boots in 1972. On the stand, she described how flattered she'd felt that her older sister wanted to wear her new back-to-school boots, the kind of small memory that stays with you because it's the last ordinary thing before everything changed. Now, nearly 5 decades later, she was looking at those same boots again, laid out in a courtroom with case photographs beside them. The defense didn't rely on one argument. They challenged the original 1972 crime lab work directly, arguing the testing procedures used back then weren't reliable enough to trust the eventual match, raising questions about contamination and handling across nearly 5 decades of storage. Then they pointed somewhere else entirely, at Walter Morris, one of the 2 people who'd found Jody's body. Morris had owned a .22 caliber rifle, the same caliber used in the murder, and had given different explanations over the years for why he was in that area that day, depending on who asked. Target shooting, according to one account, parking, according to another, picking berries, according to a third. Morris had since died, so jurors only saw a recorded deposition instead of hearing from him directly. Investigators had tested DNA from his estranged son, a sheriff's deputy, which seemed to rule that branch of the family out, though the defense pointed out Morris himself was never tested directly, and the biological link to that son wasn't fully confirmed either. It was a theory, not a finding, and no charges were ever filed against Morris. The jury, based on the verdict that followed, didn't appear to give it much weight.
The most striking piece of evidence wasn't physical at all. Prosecutors played a recorded jail call where Miller told his wife, in his own words, that the case wasn't winnable, and went on to describe the evidence against him as more than enough to convict on its own. In closing arguments, prosecutors leaned hard on that call, telling jurors that nobody forces an innocent man to make a statement like that to his own wife. The defense countered by returning to their two arguments one more time: the unreliable original testing and the unresolved questions around Walter Morris, asking jurors to weigh 46-year-old science against a man's freedom. The jury started deliberating that Friday afternoon and went home for the weekend without reaching a decision. Monday morning, November 9th, 2020, the jury came back to keep deliberating. Miller was found dead at his home that morning, with his cause of death left for the medical examiner to determine. The jury had no idea any of this had happened. They spent the day working through the same evidence as before, and by the afternoon, still unaware Miller had died, they reached a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. There was no sentencing because there was no longer anyone left to sentence. Washington law allows a guilty verdict to stand even if a defendant dies before sentencing, as long as the verdict itself was reached properly. Judge Kurtz confirmed that it had been and let the conviction stand. The case closed on paper. Posthumous convictions are unusual enough that legal experts took note of this one. In Washington state, the practical effect of a posthumous conviction like this is limited. There's no prison term to serve, no appeal to file, no further legal process. What it does is settle the legal record, and for the Loomis family, that mattered. The man at the center of it never heard the word read out loud in the courtroom. After 48 years open, this became Snohomish County's longest-running homicide case to finally close.